Bonnie, it is so good to see you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Steve.
Our pleasure. So, would you begin by introducing yourself?
My name is Bonnie NIxon. I'm the Director of Sustainability and ESG at the Long Beach Container Terminal, which is at the Port of Long Beach today. I also am a professor of supply chain sustainability at Harvard and UCLA. And if that's not enough, I'm also completing my own PhD thesis on modern slavery and environmental justice in complex supply chains.
Just for our listeners, I know that you have a little bit more experience in that. HP Products, the Sustainability Consortium that Walmart did, Mattel. You've been doing sustainability stuff for like a year or two?
I actually started in sustainability back in, believe it or not, 1979 was when 3 Mile Island occurred while I was at Penn State. And that's what originally inspired me. And from that point, I spent many years in with the public sector, working on the Boston Harbor Cleanup Project and in infrastructure, working on water, wastewater, transportation, hazardous waste, land use planning, all of those wonderful things with the public sector. And then, in 1997, I was asked by a vice president of Hewlett Packard to join and design the whole supply chain social and environmental responsibility effort. So I spent 13 years there. Afterwards, became the executive director of the Sustainability Consortium that's was funded initially and largely by Walmart, but then included all of its suppliers. And then, I moved to Southern California to head corporate social responsibility and environmental sustainability at Mattel Toys. So I come from a long line of working in the consumer product space.
So it sounds fair to say that you actually not only are knowledgeable about this issue, but you care.
I care very deeply about this issue. I care very deeply.
And again, thank you for sharing some thoughts with us. So let me ask you, what info are you asking from your suppliers? What are the key things? Ultimately, our listeners or members of ISSA are going to be asked to respond to requests from folks like you. So what are you asking for?
I've always felt that you can't really understand supply chain if you don't understand product life cycle assessments and how products are made, where they're sourced from, what part of the world the ingredients are coming from, or the source products. If you have cotton in a rag, then where is that cotton being picked from? If you are using a particular chemical, what petrochemical plant or what refinery or what part of the world is that coming from? And so I think that having a sense of both things, that it's like how products are conceived, designed, manufactured, processed, brought to market, delivered, are all equally important to, what are your health and safety practices? What are your environmental practices? What are your human rights or labor practices? And finally, what are your ethical practices? Ensuring that, very possibly the part of the world that's coming from there may be corruption and bribery. And in fact, in some of the less economically prosperous or disadvantaged regions or populations of the world, they resort to that because that's the way that they can survive. And so we have to really understand where our things are coming from and understand the vulnerabilities of those things, and then ask questions that are viable. So, focus first and foremost on what you would call the zero tolerance issues. Like we don't want child labor or slave labor participating in this. Next is we'd want to ensure that nobody's limbs and lives are in danger, that it's safe. Next, you want to be sure that you're not flagrantly dumping into the environment, whether that's putting something on the soil, releasing it into the river, releasing it directly into emissions in the air. And then finally, just really looking for that sort of corruption and bribery piece. Those are really the net zero, not net zero, the zero tolerance issues that you need to hone in on and make sure that these things aren't happening in your supply chain. And then next comes how do you do business and what are your practices and can you share something about that? And providing education at the same time you're asking for information and trying to enforce responsible practices. So recognizing that people, if they're not doing something, it's likely because they don't have the capacity, they don't have the tools, they haven't been trained that way. So giving them the benefit of the doubt and going, okay, here's some slides, here's a place you can go, here's a consultant you can go to, here's a class or a university or an academic institution that can provide you with these details, just pointing them in the right direction and giving them that guidance, that really makes a big difference.
And am I correct to assume that those comments about what to look for don't just apply to products, but also to services?
Very much so. I mean, I myself found that out because having worked at Hewlett Packard, we had a large employee base in India, more than 50,000 workers at call centers. So that was a service. And how those people got driven to and from work, what their working hours were, how they were being paid, whether they were being paid in the country and the currency of their origin. Was a broker responsible for bringing them there? Was that contract in integrity? All those things and services are critical, but particularly since we find that many of the people that come to work in these service organizations may not speak the language, they may not understand the financial currencies and the numbers and how we're figuring things out. And so taking the time to make sure that they are not being, violated in some way and they're, participating and explained to, and that you're doing things legally. A lot of times we find, particularly in other countries, they may bring people from Indonesia to work in Vietnam, and yet they're still paying them in Indonesian currency, and so so therefore they're told, well, you're getting minimum wage, but that's not true because they should be getting minimum wage in the country they're in, not the country that they're from. So if people are brought here to the US from Mexico and they're used to pesos and they're used to a certain amount of money, they need to be explained minimum wage here is this much. It's $10, it's $15 in this state, in this country. And here's what that looks like in pesos, So.
Thank you. Okay, next. Trends. You've been doing this a long time. What do you see are the trends especially in the immediate future?
I think the key trends, one is that since the financial communities, the investment communities, the accountants, the so-called metrics people have gotten involved in the discussion, we're seeing much more demand for disclosure, much more requirements about being transparent and demonstrating year-over-year progress. And more importantly, also, how do we compare apples to apples? For a long time, for example, in the climate conversation, we had companies that were measuring themselves by activity basis. What kind of activity, how many times did I drive? How many hours did I use this piece of equipment? Well, now I think the financial people coming in have said, wait a second, let's use fuel consumption. Let's use diesel consumption, gasoline consumption, natural gas, electricity usage, propane usage. Let's use these to measure our greenhouse gas footprint. And that is the kind of conversation we need to be having where we're truly comparing apples to apples. So that I think is one powerful trend. And I think they'll set the tone for many other areas as well on what is acceptable and not acceptable in terms of chemical composition or labor practices. I think the other trend is this whole drive and move towards what we're calling scope 3, which ultimately for us is supply chain. And it's not that this is new. I mean, as I mentioned, I started doing this in 1997 for the electronic sector and then expanded out to the apparel and the cleaning and the toy and all of the different sectors, jewelry. And what we're seeing is a true recognition that what scope 3 is, or what it means to collect your suppliers' emissions, is that you're asking them to do their direct emissions, their scope 1, and their scope 2, where do they get their electricity from? So that's what scope 1 is, like our direct operational footprint. Scope 2 is the energy, electricity that we purchase. And scope 3 is, what are my partners doing? What is my supply chain doing? And so I think we see this trend towards it's time for us to start taking responsibility for our total footprint and recognize, at least in a country like ours, in America and Western Europe, we're not making very much anymore. It's really being made globally around the world and largely in the Southern Hemisphere. And so how do we remain accountable for that whole supply chain just because we outsourced it, just because we globalized, just because it's being grown, deforested, mined, refined somewhere else? So how do we participate with all of those people? And I think that's a second and very powerful trend. And I'd have to say the third is that I think for those of us who've been working in the climate space and the environmental space now, for me, for almost 4 decades, we've known about these impacts, these consequences, these severe climate events that are hitting us now. We've been predicting this for at least 20 years. So it's not a surprise to us. I think it's hitting society and humanity in a different way. It's like, whoa, I didn't think in my lifetime I would see these kinds of severe firestorms, these floods, these heat numbers and heat indexes operating, this temperature in the ocean, or, and so I think that in many ways, that's a new trend where people are starting to go, maybe we have actually affected, life on Earth, and maybe we need to do something different.
Indeed. Okay, so the cleaning industry has some very large companies that participate in the S&P 500, publicly traded companies that are going to be required to do reporting. But the vast majority of the companies that we're dealing with are really smaller companies. So it's really the scope 3 supply chain related issues. And for those companies that are just getting started, what are your recommendations for what they should do to help them really get started and be successful?
I think that you're saying the largest companies are, quite honestly, and if I could just, along with my students, along with the Walmart Consortium, along with just my own research over the years in supply chains, it's not any mystery to everyone that the major companies that distribute these kinds of cleaning products are Unilever, Procter & Gamble, Dial Henkel. Now, these companies have been being asked to do things for more than a decade, probably 2 decades now. There's been a lot of pressure on them to disclose what they're doing. So the first thing that I would do if I was a smaller company bringing some new product to market, if I had been in the place of 7th generation or method or, what's Even Glow, or different companies. If I was bringing a product to market, I'd be looking at how did those companies evolve, and what are they disclosing, and how are they sharing information about their supply chain. So rather than reinventing something completely new, I would look to benchmark and see what certifications have they gone after, what groups are they participating in, how can I learn from what they've done well and what they haven't done so well, and do my research. So that's probably one of the first things I would do. I mean, the second thing I would do is obviously really strive to truly be clean, recognize that there is a way to do this, by mimicking nature. I mean, there's a whole framework called biomimicry, which really what tries to build on the fact that for 40 million years, nature did this well. Nature did not create and still does not create waste, has a framework in it that truly understands you can use lemon, you can use vinegar, you can use natural things. And so how do you do that so that not only is it not bad for the items or the surfaces or you may be cleaning, but mostly for the people that are exposed. I mean, really, that's truly the goal, is let's not expose people and or ecosystems to unnecessary toxicity. I mean, we all know that we have become an incredibly toxic society, and so we shouldn't be surprised when we see viruses or we see increasing amounts of cancer and diseases, because we have made these choices. And so the question is, how can we make alternative choices? And then how can we work with parties and entities and media and companies to expose the positive benefits of that? So I would really challenge the cleaning industry to get clean, truly get clean, and learn from what has been done well and what hasn't been done well.
You mentioned some great companies in our industry, and actually I assure you that there's dozens, if not hundreds of more really good companies out there in addition to those that you mentioned. And actually, I appreciate your challenge, but I think candidly, a lot of industry sectors should take a look at what the cleaning industry has done. In many respects, I think we're ahead of what many sectors are doing, but just don't get the attention or the respect that the cleaning industry deserves. But that's a different discussion.
And I trust, Steve, you know a lot more about this industry than I do. I mean, what my remit at a particular point in time was to sort of go, okay, who's got the largest share in the marketplace? What, how are they? I mean, quite frankly, they have been buying up a lot of the smaller companies. And in fact, there were some of the responsible companies they've been, and that's happening in every industry sector. It's not just the cleaning sector. It's happening in the apparel sector. It's happening in look at makeup. You got L'Oreal and Estee Lauder own the majority of brands, and you're seeing that in every sector. Massive consolidation. So I applaud those companies that, stand out and stick up for what they know is right and don't necessarily get consumed by that big machine. But I think we also have to be honest on what the percentages are in the total marketplace. And that's when you work with the largest retailers in the world, like the Walmarts, the Targets, the Amazons, the Costco's. You look at who you can affect and that will have the largest impact in the fastest way, and you're really looking for scale. And that's the world I've lived in, and even today that I live in as a person responsible for supply chain and shipping. I look at the largest ships that are bringing the most amount of products here, and how can I positively affect them? How can I put pressure or incentivize them to change the bunker fuel they're using to clean fuel, to hydrogen, to a new engine with green methanol? What is that going to take? How can we affect the trucks that distribute all of these products? And so really, it's I know that cleaning sector, much like every other sector, has so many bright spots as well. And I think that our job is to make transparent where it's not bright and enlighten those places.
Thank you. Okay, last question. Have I missed anything? Is there anything else that you want to share with us?
No, I think it's I really look forward to learning more about your sector. I myself, even here at the terminal, I work with the facilities people on a daily basis and look at who they're buying from, what they're buying from, making sure that we ourselves are not exposing people to unnecessary hazards, and I think that we've got a lot of work still in front of us, particularly in that sort of southern hemisphere that we've had such a big impact on. Like, I'm a true believer, Steve, that to whom much is given, much is expected. And, we are the ones that have, in many cases, gone down to those continents, those countries, and use their resources and continue to use their resources. And I think it's our responsibility as well to bring some of these more responsible, cleaner, more ethical practices to them so that they don't suffer.
You're awesome. Thank you very much for spending some time with us. We greatly appreciate it, and we appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.